Now, I know that sometimes when we talk about anxiety, we often think it's not a normal thing, but it is a normal thing. Um, as mentioned, anxiety is normal and it can alert us to danger. It's a natural response that we have. So through the evolutionary theory, back in the day when we were in the caves, the theory is that our way of knowing that there's distress or there's danger around us would be to often the anxiety, that actual emotion, is that feeling that we get. It's our body's, as mentioned, a natural alarm to say, wake up, what's going on? Something might not be right. So yeah, it's a natural process. Again, it's normal to be anxious. Just before I started today, I was anxious and I thought, yeah, that's normal. But obviously, excessive anxiety, for example, social anxiety or generalized anxiety, that can be quite high. Um, yeah, not so normal. So it's quite important to be aware of that within children. When's it a problem? It's when it interferes with your day-to-day routines and when you experience distress above same age peers, especially with children. So let's say, for example, you're in a school setting and a child who would normally engage with other children and you've noticed has become quite withdrawn. Might not want to interact with the other children, but was interacting with other children prior to that. They might want to sit on their own. They might want to not have anything to do with anybody else. They might be very quiet, even if you're teaching or you're working as an assistant or supporting the child, or you've just come into the school to observe. So then it can be a problem because then this child is not being able to voice their opinions, what their wants are, what their needs are. And also in regards to wants and needs, we all know that, I don't know if some of you are aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Our basic needs need to be met in order for us to progress and grow through childhood and also into adulthood to be healthy adults. So our need to really socially interact with other people is something that is part of our DNA, is something in our genetics, is something that we should be doing. So now that we've kind of covered a little bit about anxiety, a general overview, I'm just going to continue and go on. So mostly, I think the main aspects are that when we do feel quite anxious, especially socially anxious, we have different types of anxiety. So you have, like I said, generalized anxiety. You might have health anxiety when people are a bit older. Various aspects, even like phobias, they are formed from anxiety. But social anxiety can be quite difficult in children to basically monitor and to be aware of it. And I think it's really important that in this day and age, we are very aware of neurodiversities. For example, ASD, being on the autistic spectrum, ADHD, and various other things. I think it can be a bit confusing because you can have children that are socially anxious, and then you have children that might have neurodiversity or other aspects or other things going on for them. And it can be quite hard to sort of be aware of, how do I know if this child is socially anxious, or how do I know they haven't got another problem going on? So when you're observing, I think one way to make it very simple to understand the needs of the children that you're working with or the child is, they have this fear of being rejected or judged by other people, or a fear of making a mistake or embarrassing themselves. The issue with that is when you're dealing with adults, and I have, working as a therapist, I've helped and supported many adults through CBT for social anxiety. They are able to express themselves. They are able to tell you that this is the issue. I don't want to go out. I'm scared. I don't want to talk or say anything in case I embarrass myself. What if I fall? What if I say something silly? What if I make a mistake? But the issue we have with children are that they're not always able to articulate themselves or express themselves. And then there's a fear of, if I say this, what if then I'm rejected or I'm judged? So it just makes it a little bit better for them to keep it to themselves. Social anxiety disorder in young children, also known as social phobia, is characterized by an intense fear or anxiety in social situations. Yes, often it is social situations. And I will give you an example of a client I worked with who struggled with social anxiety and then came to me as an adult for treatment. So, and I think it was quite important because now we're talking about children with social anxiety. It was quite I thought it was quite a good example to give you guys today in regards to how this person's anxiety had increased and made her life quite difficult until she came in for treatment. While it is normal for children to feel shy, anxious, yep, absolutely, it's normal, especially in unfamiliar situations. Social anxiety disorder involves persistent and extreme discomfort, and it can interfere with daily life and development. And I was also thinking about this. I would like to talk a couple of minutes, maybe talking a little bit about selective mutism as well. So, selective mutism, yeah, it's usually often children that will decide not to speak. It's selective, meaning they choose when they would like to speak and they decide when they don't want to speak. And that's a bit of a tricky one. I remember working when I was teaching with a young lady, and the silence was just pretty shocking. I didn't know what to do with myself. Sorry, I've just seen someone put something in the chat. What would you say is the youngest age social anxiety can start? At what sort of age are children aware or affected by this? That's a great question, Megan. Thank you. So, again, it can vary depending on that child's experiences. If, for example, a child is growing up in an environment that isn't the greatest environment, because not all of us are blessed to have good parents or a nurturing, loving environment, it can start a lot early on. It all depends on the factors in regards to who those children are surrounded by. So if it's at home, it could start earlier, definitely. It's very difficult to pinpoint a certain age. But if, for example, a child is going into school and the issues are stemming from school, it can then happen within a school setting. So it's very hard to sort of pinpoint that. However, having worked as a SEN officer and observing the social aspects, I think for adults, when we're observing, it can be very difficult for us to be aware of that quite early on, because sometimes it could just be the child being shy. It can be quite difficult to highlight that or establish what it is. So I would say that in regards to that, yeah, better not to put an age on it, just to sort of, no problem. It's better just to kind of be a bit open-minded and observe behaviours. But yeah, I think tend to having writing lots of EHCP plans over the years. I would only actually mention it if a child was over the age of 4. I mean, selective mutism is a bit different. I mean, the child that I worked with, she was a young girl, about 14 years old. And yeah, she chose not to speak to me. It didn't matter how nice I was. She didn't want to talk to me, and that was that. She decided. But I did see her talk to another teacher who she'd known a good 3-4 years before that. But it was just shocking because, we had silence throughout the whole session. And I would go over to her and talk to her, and she would just look at me very blankly, not even a smile. And this went on for a whole year. And I think one day I actually was observing her in the canteen, and she started speaking to she was talking to her friends, and I just couldn't believe it, because can you imagine a whole hour or 2 of English, sometimes 2-hour sessions of silence from this child? Absolutely nothing. And the way I treated it was, maybe she doesn't trust me. Often when children are very, very anxious, let's say they've been brought up in an environment that's quite tense, could be a parent, could be mother, could be father, whatever parent, doesn't really matter which parent, but it can be quite difficult if a child is trying to speak to a parent, and sometimes they might have parents with mental health problems. They might not want to speak because they realize they learn from an early age that if I talk to my mother or my father, someone that should be trusted, should make me feel safe, they're taught quite early on that actually you're going to get shouted at. If you come to me with a problem, parent might humiliate the child. That's where the judgment might comes from. That might be where the mistake comes from, in the form of embarrassment, where they're being made to feel that if they say something, it's wrong. So it's better just to keep quiet. And it becomes a behaviour that is, like I said, controlled behaviour because of the anxiety. It's easier not to say something. If you say something, you get shouted at. So why don't I just keep quiet? So it is a learned behaviour, and it can change over the years. But I will talk about an example of one of my clients. I think that's a really good example, but I'm just going to go on to the next slide for now. Actually, before I do that, I think I'm going to share with you a story about my client, because it links in quite nicely to this slide before I move on, if that's okay. Yeah, so this young lady, young girl, at the age of But she came to treatment at the age of 19, very lovely young girl, very nice. Very quiet, came across quite shy when I first met her. And as we got working together, through CPT sessions, we must have got to session number 6, and she never mentioned this before, which is really unusual. When we go through our assessment process, we usually ask about the early years experiences and so forth. She never revealed this, so it must have been maybe she didn't trust me as a therapist, or maybe she just felt that had to be built on. But anyway, we got to session number 6, and I went into her early years experiences again. And she'd mentioned that she was quite afraid, of, even at this age, into adulthood, talking out loud. If, for example, presentations, she was very afraid of presentations. She had these behaviours in place before the presentations. She'd get very anxious. She wouldn't sleep. And there were other behaviours. For example, she wouldn't give eye contact. She'd look down. These were her own behaviours that she'd picked up over the years. And when we kind of went into the reason behind it, it was actually embarrassment. At the age of 10, she was on a skills trip with her friends, her peers. They'd gone away from the school. And they were on a 2-3 day, I think it was a camping trip, she described. She had a brother also at the school. They went away, and all of a sudden they get called back into school. And she said she remembers very well that the teacher had only asked her to return back to the school. The rest of the children carried on. So in that time frame, she felt like she'd done something wrong. She was like, maybe I've done something and I'm going to get told off now. So there was a fear there instantly. I've made a mistake. Why am I being sent away? She didn't know what the reason was. Anyway, she was taken back into school. She described how she was sat in the head teacher's office, and her and her brother had also come from another session, and they were sat in a room, and they were given the most terrible news, devastating news, that their father had died. She was only 10, her brother was only 8. And in that moment, we spoke a little bit about that, but she didn't remember too much about the emotions and what happened. However, the thing that she really remembered was the feeling of embarrassment. She said, I was going through grief. I was in pain. I was a child. I couldn't believe it. And I said, but why did you feel embarrassed? And she said, as me and my brother were walking from the head teacher's office, we had to then go to the assembly. And I said, oh, it's a bit odd. She said, yeah, we had to go to assembly. And it was like a lunchtime assembly that they'd set up. Got to the assembly. And she said, I'm sitting there thinking, what are we doing here? Our dad has just died. It's a bit odd. They sat in assembly, and all of a sudden the head teacher decides to reveal to the entire school that their father had just died while they were there in the hall. And she said she was a lovely girl, didn't really explain her emotions very well, but she did say, oh, I felt really embarrassed. And I said, why? She goes, because everybody started looking at me and my brother. They were looking, and they're like, that's the girl whose dad just died. They were pointing, there was pointing going on. And she remembers that so well that she said she kept looking down. She said, I was embarrassed. Like, why was everyone pointing at me? I'm the girl. I was labelled, me and my brother were labelled as the children just lost their dad. That's how we were known in the school. And that memory of that one situation, a huge significant event that stayed with her for the rest of her life. At this age, now she was 18, 19, she's coming to therapy, was still struggling with it. She still was managing with the same behaviours that she'd picked up quite early on. So I think the reason I want to share that story with you is because I've obviously dealt with adults that have experienced social anxiety as children. And I think one of the questions today was, when can it start? It can start at different times for different reasons. So for this young person, it was purely because of the father dying and the distress and then the embarrassment. And she did mention that when she went to school after that, it continued. People would just say, oh, wasn't she the girl whose dad died? Wasn't that her brother? So she always had this fear of people pointing at her, and that led into adulthood.